Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming, and welcome to the first session of The Great Game, Writings of a Lost Avant-Garde by Professor Jason Babak Mohaghegh. Now, before we get to the session proper, I do want to begin with describing the seminar in question. So, to begin. From 1928 to 1932, in Reims, France, four obscure youth formed a secret society devoted to exploring the outer boundaries of the universal. Such was the genesis of an association later known as the Great Game, Le Grand Jeu, an inner circle whose experiments with drug visions, near-death experiences, and anesthesia included ingesting poisonous leaves, strychnine, opium, and carbon tetrachloride, a cleaning fluid and insect killer, mastering sightless movement by bicycling through their rural town blindfolded and attempting panoptic vision, seeing hidden visual phenomenon without using the eyes, practicing auto-asphyxiation or holding sharpened instruments against each other's throats while writing, and focusing their gaze on mirror surfaces for hours until the reflective image blurred and began motioning with strange, ghostly autonomy. This seminar is an intensive study of the recently translated writings of this short-lived alliance of the Great Game, envied by the Surrealist leaders who craved their subordination in several failed attempts, led by the mystical seer René Dalmel, and the dark angel Roger Joubert Lecomte, who wrote of glimpsing the impersonal instant of eternity and emptiness. We will study the newly published collection of their most intimate and influential writings, rescued from a silenced archive to win their rightful place as perhaps the most brilliant and daring lost souls of the avant-garde. Together, we will read texts such as The Night Battle and The Seductiveness of Voltage as prophetic formulations of the philosophy of fatal risk that never fully emerged, yet left behind remnants like no other. We will extract the most provocative theories behind their parapsychic trials and experimental metaphysics, their pseudonyms and secret gatherings, their rebellion and outcast status amid the dominant vanguards of their time, their near-lethal techniques of sensing the void, and their principles of horrible revelation sealed in blood pact of four young geniuses. Moreover, we will use this seminar to expand their thoughts and contemplate what next ventures they might have undertaken, if not burning out and collapsing after just a few years of incendiary activity. Or, as they wrote in their elegant omen of a preface, the great game is irremediable. It is played only once. We wish to play it every moment of our lives. It is a case of loser wins, since the aim is to lose oneself, and we want to win. Now, Jason did ask me to dispense for the most part with the bio, but just so that I can do my due diligence, Jason Babak Mohaghegh is Associate Professor of Comparative Literature at Babson College, interested in tracking the currents of experimental thought between the Middle East and the West and their forms of art and philosophy. And his particular highlights in his bibliography include, but are not limited to, let's see, The Insurgent, Poet, Mystic, Sectarian, The Four Masks of an Eastern Postmodernism, published in SUNY 2015, Omnicide, Mania, Fatality, and the Future in Delirium, published by Urbanomics, speaking of which, Robin and Amy, Where is Omnicide 2? And Night, A Philosophy of the After Dark by Zero Books 2019, which is also coming with a second volume, actually next week, this Saturday, if a certain mega corporation is to be believed. But enough of that derail. Jason, you are alive.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I appreciate it. Every class that I have taught, or every seminar that I've devised for the new center, has typically revolved around a topic that I find fascinating. That's my criterion, fascination, wanting to share with all of you these precious gems that I find to be captivating and mesmerizing in some particular way. So we explore thematics and ideas that have that capacity for astonishment. But this is the first seminar I've ever taught where the topic actually breaks my heart. This makes me extremely sad. At the same time that I find it exhilarating. I have read the story of these four young boys tens and tens of times. And it took me a couple of decades to get right with it, and still not right with it. The untimely exhaustion of their movement, the quick burnout of it, the tragic ending of a few of them by disease, by addiction, and just the sense that essentially it was, to some extent, a wasted destiny. And trying to track that type of phenomenon is something that is at the outset so Today, actually, what we're going to do to start, and we'll do introductions at the end in a kind of special, unique way, because I know most of you, but I always like to challenge some specificity that really shows your signature rather than the typical biography. But we're actually going to read the introduction to the theory of the great game together for our first session. Now, even if you've read it before, I've read these 7 or 8 pages, maybe 30 or 40 times myself. And every time I go back, certain details strike me, just about the sheer fragility of this movement, this group of 4 people who came together, and why it burned out, why it faded, but why it also ascended so miraculously for a time. So we're going to read that, and we'll try and isolate some of the intriguing scaffolding of what makes possible something like the Great Game and what they embodied for a while. But to start that, then let me share screen. Is everyone seeing this? Great. So the movement is Le Grand Jeu, as Andrew said, the Great Game. The dates are 1922 to 1932. It's about a 10-year existence, but they only really published their writings for 4 years, from the 1928 to 1932, and that even is a bit of an exaggeration. They had four editions, we'll read about that, of this journal of theirs. The 4th one was doomed from the outset and really never came to fruition. So really 3 in essence. Location, as was mentioned in the introduction, Reims, France, which for those who don't know is not a cosmopolitan center the way that Paris is. And we'll talk about that to some extent. The fact that while Surrealism was really the kind of monstrous counterpart to Le Grand Jeu, while they could only thrive in a centralized capital like Paris, Reims is the perfect location for these 4 youth to pull off what they were doing, which caught the attention of the Surrealists, as was mentioned earlier, to the extent that they tried to co-opt them several times, and were really in awe and envy of their abilities. Reims, France, also, by the way, the school that they met in, these four young people, is also the school that Jean Baudrillard went to over a generation later. It's his high school as well, intriguingly. And he once said that they still haunt the halls. Their specters are there. So anyway, the main figures of this are Roger Gilbert Lecomte, who for me is the most crucial figure for us to analyze. Lecomte only wrote one really other book, Black Mirror, which will be a source of what presentations come. He wrote 2 other works, 2 volumes of a philosophical collection called This Book is a Ghost, which each one of them is only about 30 or 40 pages long. They're kind of aphoristic fragments of a philosophy, and a compilation of poetry, which was later called Black Mirror, which has a preface. It was an obscure work that almost no one read, with a preface by none other than Antonin Artaud. And Artaud almost never did anything like that. In fact, I can't even think of another example of when he ever endorsed anyone's work. And it's only a page long, and we'll read that together too, what Artaud says. But he basically attributes to this 16-year-old boy here, Roger Gilbert Lecomte, the power of ancients who could summon thunder. And so we'll talk about what he means by that. He doesn't mean it literally, he means it though at some existential level. So the concept that I want us to begin with before we dive into the actual biography of the movement is the idea of a mirage, because that's really what they were playing for. Le Grand Jeu is not a fully realized movement, and perhaps that's a good thing, because we've seen fully realized movements. Again, their counterpart, Surrealism, was overwrought in its realization, meaning it persisted too long, one could say. Persisted to the point that they started adopting Stalinism as an ideology. Persisted to the point that they began excommunicating some of their most vital members, from Antonin Artaud to Georges Bataille to Dali, who had numerous midnight trials where he was kicked out for a while. The Surrealist Manifestos, which are stunning documents, but nevertheless become increasingly tyrannical and constrictive over time. So one can make an argument that that surrealism lasted too long to a certain extent. And by the way, still lasts. There's still 1,000 imitations and copycats. I love the fact that I have never seen an attempted imitation of Le Grand Jeu. And yet I still see movies that win Academy Awards that are basically third-rate surrealism, all the time. And it had offshoots like magical realism in Latin America and in other, and then there were surrealisms in Egypt and in Turkey and in Tokyo and all across the world. But Le Grand Jeu no one bothered or dared to ever try and resuscitate or resurrect it. Some could say, I had front row seats to the inner circles of deconstruction in the 90s, studying with Derrida. That was a movement who, if you ask me personally, I would say definitely overstayed its welcome, was too fully realized to the point that it became zombified. Some might make that argument about speculative realism now. And so here we have something different to trace. Not those who grew old and boring and petty, but rather those who, like a shooting star, emerged and disappeared just as quickly, leaving us to wonder, as you see there, what could have been. And that's an amazing question, to try and analyze what could have been, not in a pseudoscientific kind of idea of the hypothetical, but actually for us to, as it's going to say further below, to dream the next levels. They left us enough unfinished business. And this happens with certain figures. Rimbaud died early. People can wonder what he would have devised in his later segments and all that. But to some extent, there's an argument to be made that it's far better to die early than to die late. And that's one of Nietzsche's equations too, right? To die at the right time. But anyway, I wanted to start with the fundamental concept of the mirage, which is something, as someone who studies Middle Eastern poetics and philosophy, is a central concept. The mirage always emerges at the hour of greatest despair, the hour of greatest vulnerability before death, and has the ability to completely rearrange not just the world of appearances, but the republic of meaning itself, the regime of meaning. There are great Arab poets from the medieval era and from the ancient world who write about seeing people drink sand and have tears of joy streaming down their face, thinking that they're being quenched. So this takes us into, if you wanted to call it psychosomatic, if you want to call it mystical, transvaluations of thought that are only beholden to the mirage. Now, mirage is a Middle Eastern concept, and it's a desert concept, but there is an oceanic parallel, which is called the Fata Morgana, for any of you who might know this concept. It's a climatological and atmospheric phenomenon, event that occurs. Sailors speak about this, where on the horizon, they'll start to see shapes emerge, jagged vertical structures, other boats. The reason it's called the Fata Morgana is because it's attributed to a sorceress from the legends of King Arthur, who was named Morgana, and she was believed, to conjure images that would mislead sailors unto their death. Really, what it is scientifically, it's a thermal inversion of contrasting layers of heat and light that then give rise to the appearance of illusory shapes on a horizon. That's Le Grand Jeu to a great extent. Are they the real thing? Are they a bluff? They are the extreme level of both of those. A strange level. They really are as good as I've ever seen, but they also are pretenders, and they didn't make it. So the fact that they exist kind of in this strange short interval between materiality and immateriality, the fact that their movement, their secret society ultimately became this explosive burst, but that lived only a half-life, and that one could call a failed destiny or a near hit, near miss kind of event. It's an intriguing thing for us to try and imagine the unrealized again. And also, and I'm particularly sensitive to this question right now as certain events are happening around the world. The more I read it, because I don't want to turn them into martyrs, the more it forces us to engage that really elegantly tragic line by Mahmoud Darwish that there's nothing, the Palestinian poet, that there's nothing worse than crying for those who die for nothing. And it would be great to be able to say that they died for this movement, but they didn't. That's not why they did. And we'll get into that, the details of that. I wish that, and this is important for us because my absolute contempt for the political on every end of its spectrum is because that's what killed my friends. And that's what always undoes things. The political at the micro level and at the macro. And they're being pressured into political ideologies and debates and conflicts and infighting and hierarchies. I wish it was because of those chapters that you see there, the seductiveness of voltage, the prophecy of the Magus King, the end of the world. I wish it was because of the content of their brilliant philosophy and poetics that they died. That would make them martyrs. But that's not what ruined them. And so we have to try and, for our own sake and for our own survival, we have to learn the lesson of what went wrong with their movement, why they were susceptible, these dreamers, to suddenly playing in the gutter that would ultimately annihilate their potential. And we'll get into the specifics of that. So the question there is, and the best answer I have for right now for the first session, and we'll unlock this together, that's our job, is that there is a really fine line between exaltation or invincibility and exhaustion or waste. It's a very, very delicate tightrope walk between their ruin and their fulfillment. And I think that when they're in the midst of the fever of things, the dream of it, the militancy of it, those passionate midnight hours when they're sitting up and discussing everything under the sun, I think they're too blind to see which side is which. And I don't blame them for that. I think it might be simply something that emerges kind of like the optical illusion of a mirage. And we can't tell how close we are to it all falling apart in those most powerful instances. So what's our role in this seminar? Our role is to become the neophytes, which is to say the new initiates into the secret society. We do that first and foremost by reading them extremely closely. So I've never done this before, but this entire seminar is devoted to one book, the short collection of their writings, which we will take in their chronological sequence. So every week we'll read a portion, we'll do extremely close reading, and we'll try to devise thoughts. But I want to entitle all of you, in as much as we will become disciples of the great game. And I love the fact that these are child princes, you know, they're all younger than almost everyone in the room here, but we're going to just sort of play beneath their thrones. Being the neophyte is also a very dangerous and subversive position, because it allows us to usher in the next wave. So part of what I want to entitle and invite everyone to do is imagine that we're actually joining them, you know, in those absinthe taverns in Reims, in those dance halls where they sat all night long and devised weird names for each other and nicknames and all that. And imagine that we allow ourselves to suggest rituals to them, to suggest certain thematics, to suggest avenues of possibility for them to explore. So that's what I want us to do, is I want us to actually play the game, not just study the game as it was played once. Theirs was round one, ours is round two. But we'll take that as a point of departure from their lead. So allowing them to lead the dance as is only right. So again, literally, I just want to start by reading very closely, and then you'll see we'll make certain conceptual parallels. So this is the introduction to the theory of the great game. Between 1928 and 1930, the Parisian magazine Le Grand Jeu ran to 3 issues before collapsing because of its editors' infighting, narcotic overindulgence, and their vehemently unreasonable aspirations for both art and life. During its brief period of activity, however, Le Grand Jeu was more than simply another of the many little magazines which flickered and vanished in the orbit of the Surrealist movement. The journal was the public face of a tightly bound group of artists and writers, the core of which, though still barely out of their teens, had been inseparable since the beginning of their high school days in provincial Reims. With the creation of their journal, this group undertook to elucidate the framework of a political mystical outlook which they had constructed over the preceding decade, and which combined an excoriating critique of the apathy and repression of contemporary Western society with a quest to take leave of the individual ego and to reconnect with a collective universal mind. The group's esoteric program united drug use and parapsychological practices with asceticism, revolutionary politics — the Russian Revolution was barely a decade old — and a prophetic mode of poetry, which they identified in antecedents such as Rimbaud and Mallarmé. Such a wildly overripe synthesis was no doubt inevitably doomed, but in its failure, the Grand Jeu group left an indelible mark on the history of those subsequent movements which have refused point blank to accept the world as it is. In this collection, then, the theory of the Grand Jeu group is presented in their own words through the essays and articles which form the bulk of their magazine. And this introduction that we're reading from is written by Dennis Dunn, who is a scholar of this movement. So, the first thing that I want to raise after reading that introduction there is the idea of their immortal youth, this paradox. Okay, so it's interesting. Jean-Luc Godard, the French filmmaker, just died, and I always liked one single quote from him, which came out of a movie which I included in a book of mine, where he said, "Become immortal, then die." It's a nice line. I think Le Grand Jeu mastered that precisely, became immortal and then died. But the immortal sensibility of their youth, this feeling again of imperishability, just running strong on the fury of their youth, is something to consider. That's part of why they take risks. That's why they're so extravagant in some ways. They thought they would last forever. You can tell at the beginning, and actually that's part of their oaths to one another. This, I'm not going to go far into the intricacies of this, but Carl Jung uses a term, synchronicity, in psychoanalysis, which is the idea of, and I don't want to apply its full logic here. It's the idea of when an unconscious or conscious wish suddenly finds itself manifested in external reality, and it feels like a bizarre convergence or echo. Is different than Freud's the uncanny, because actually for Jung it should be more conscious. Like you knew that you wanted something. It's a desire that then suddenly manifests, and he referred to it as a kind of philosophy of meaningful coincidence. And I want to give Le Grand Jeu, I want to give these four young individuals all the credit in the world, but I also want all of us to start by realizing how purely coincidental and incidental the circumstances are by which they meet one another and by which this becomes possible. So I already mentioned that the city as a kind of backdrop, knowing, and we'll read about it, what Reims was like at the time, having a very decadent nightlife culture that other cities in France did not have, more conservative cities. That's instrumental. The school they went to is absolutely instrumental. They meet a philosophy teacher who, I know in the United States where I teach, I don't think there is even a philosophy teacher in high schools anywhere, but they had a high school philosophy teacher who started teaching them esoteric, arcane, mystical rituals. You know, that's the luck of that, the pure luck of that, the pure fortune of that. And then the age, which is a very dangerous, loaded question of what is their relationship to the era and the epocality. They are in that short window blast of the avant-garde. You know, Dadaism, one of the great writers of Dadaism later joins them. The movement doesn't ultimately only have four people. It ultimately gathers a few more in those 3 or 4 years, one of them being a very, very well-known legendary Dadaist who had a lot of credibility in the avant-garde already established. but decided to join them instead of surrealism, which we'll get into. And so the fact that futurism, Dadaism, surrealism, Kafka has been made kind of known at that time. There are a lot of figures. The avant-garde is right. What is their relationship to it? Are they byproducts of that avant-gardism? Are they countercurrents to it? Are they totally irrelevant to it in some way? It is a question for us to ask. What I can say is this: while we have to separate their philosophical poetic project and their existential project from their historical downfall, there is no doubt that the external circumstances of their time undid them, unraveled them. But whether or not we can reduce their words to, again, the epocality or locality or context, I would say no. That would be an oversimplification. This movement this secret society could only have happened where it did and when it did, but it also could have happened anywhere. That's a strange paradox that we'll get into. So at any rate, to understand sort of the affective nature of immortal youth as a concept, right? And in the history of French literature, and they are French, there is the concept of the enfant terrible, the terrible child, kind of, and Rimbaud being one of the incarnations of that, but there are others, and so they have a little bit of that aspect to them. But I actually think that, and this is what I want to do as a kind of surprise, every time we encounter some element of their biography today in our discussion, in our reading, I'm going to pair them with mostly a Palestinian poet, because I can't think of another poetic tradition in the world that is also more inclined to the what could have been, to the wasted destiny, the idea of wasted, than Palestinian poetics. And so this is Taha Muhammad Ali, who writes a poem called Thrombosis in the Veins of Petroleum. And this is a kind of idea of immortal youth. When I was a child, I fell into a pit, but didn't die. I sank in a pond when I was young, but did not die. And now, God help us, one of my habits is running into battalions of minds along the border, as my songs in the days of my youth are dispersed. Here a flower, there a scream, and yet I do not die. They butchered me on the doorstep like a lamb for the feast, thrombosis in the veins of petroleum. So again, an echo or parallel incursion. Then we go further in our reading, and the author or the editor of this text, the author of the introduction here, decided to make an interesting move. He fast forwards us, sort of time travels us, not to the beginning of their movement yet, but rather to a very crucial encounter where basically the surrealists had decided to ambush them. They held a meeting that was supposed to be an open invitation. We will talk about that, but then it became an attack against the four youth of the Grand Jeu. So a meeting at the Bar du Château. A Monday evening in early March 1929, in a bar in Montparnasse, Paris, the major figures of surrealism and the groups affiliated with it were convening to discuss the possibility of collective action. The movement had been fragmenting for some time, driven by questions of ideology and artistic direction, exacerbated by the disputative methods of its leader, André Breton, which had seen the expulsion or alienation of key figures such as Antonin Artaud and Georges Bataille. The pretext for the Bar du Château meeting then was promising: a proposal for reconciliation and communal endeavor, expressed in a letter of invitation, which was sent to peripheral and even dissident figures with the broader surrealist and post-Dada movements. Again, I want you to see how obscenely petty this gesture is. Under the auspices of collectivist action in a time of war, it becomes an excuse to try and attack 4 19-year-olds. So the letter, composed by Raymond Queneau, begins in a tone which is almost playful in the scrupulousness with which it avoids reopening old wounds or invoking specific disputes. Quote, "You are not, as far as one is aware, wholly disinterested in the possibilities of common action among a certain number of men whom you admire more or less, having known them more or less, and having had more or less the opportunity to judge them according to this or that act, private or public, and despairing or hoping rightly or wrongly, for more or less from them. It goes on to ask those invited to consider whether, how, and with whom they might take part in a shared undertaking. 1. Do you believe that all things considered, your activity should or should not be limited, definitively or not, to an individual form? 2. If yes, will you, so that it might unite the majority of us, undertake to set forth your motives, define your position? B. If no, to what extent do you feel a common activity can be continued or resumed? What would be its nature? With whom would you wish or consent to conduct it? All right, these are all loaded, charged questions, as you can see, that are meant to examine the credentials of those that are there. Notice how grotesquely systematic and almost bureaucratically fascistic the method and the tonality of this is. It's almost like a survey from a human resources sort of department. But at any rate, for some, the olive branch was not an enticing. Several important figures stayed away that night. For Bataille, the proposed collective was filled with, quote, a load of fucking idealists. Nevertheless, as the meeting began, among the 30 or so who crowded into the bar were Man Ray, René Magritte, Hans Arp, Louis Aragon, Yves Tanguay, René Crevel, and the former Dadaist Georges Rimont Dessin, as well as Breton and Queneau. Also there, in a well-represented faction, were the writers and artists associated with Le Grand Jeu, the journal's young editors, René Domal and Roger Gilbert-Lecomte, the painter Jacob Sima, the photographer Arthur Harfo, the writer Roger Valland, and the poet and artist Maurice Henry. Early on in the meeting, Breton announced that before the form of any collective action could be discussed, it would be necessary to establish the, quote, individual moral qualification of those who would be involved. What followed was a detailed attack on certain opinions expressed in Le Grand Jeu and elsewhere by its members, ranging from those probably designed expressly to infuriate the Surrealists, the tendency in their writing to employ that most reactionary of terms, God. So you may or may not know this, but one of the principles of the Surrealist Manifesto that Breton then later outlined was the complete prohibition on any reference to gods whatsoever, which is why Artaud and Bataille, among many other reasons, were excommunicated. Another one of his things that's not mentioned here by Nance Duncan is Breton's particular allergy, neurotic allergy to vulgarity. So again, Bataille and Artaud were both persona non grata, completely unwelcome because they're kings of cursing. But he also excommunicated Dali for this reason. If anybody knows, famously, in one of his famous paintings of a prophetic figure holding a cross to an elephant with ostrich legs, the gentleman, prophetic figure, is in his underwear and it's stained. And Breton found this such a hideous image and such a childish gesture that he kicked out Dali for a while as well. So these are among certain reasons, but here we go. The tendency therein to employ that most reactionary of terms, God. Their provocative claim to have more sympathy with an executed serial killer than with a pair of executed anarchists, which they did say, by the way. Now, before we continue here then, we get our second concept, which is that of siege. Right? And this is a Palestinian poetic concept continually used, hasar, which means to be under siege, literally surrounded, the way sort of Genghis Khan, the idea comes in the history of warfare from when Genghis Khan, I mean, there was always sieges, but he was the master of laying siege to cities and making them fortify themselves internally until they starved to death or surrendered eventually. But Mahmoud Darwish, perhaps the greatest Palestinian poet, one of the greatest poets ever to walk the earth, has this short little elegiac poem in which he talks about the experience of being under siege. Winds shift against us. The southern wind blows with our enemies. The passage narrows. We flash victory signs in the darkness, so the darkness may glitter. We fly as if riding the trees of a dream. O ends of the earth, O difficult dream, will you go on? For the 1000th time we write on the last breath of air, we die so they do not prevail. We run after the echo of our voices. May we find a moon there. We sing for the rocks. May the rocks be startled. We engrave our bodies with iron for a river to billow up. Winds shift against us, north wind with southern wind, and we shout, where can we settle? We ask mythical women for relatives who would rather see us dead. An eagle settles on our bodies and we chase after dreams. May we find them. They soar behind us to find us here. There is no escape. We live our death. This half-death is our triumph. This is a highly intricate, elaborate poem that we could spend a lot of time on, but we don't have time. Neither did Le Grand Jeu. That's part of our problem that we learned from them. But some of these questions, some of these statements, we die so they do not prevail. Could one apply that to their movement? Absolutely. So at any rate, and the reference to the dreams that they're not sure will go on. So anyway, this is a look into the experience of siege that they definitely felt they were under. And it's a lot to ask. Again, for us, these become historical figures, and it's very easy and cliched at this point to, in our contemporary cynicism, to dismiss historical figures, or forget Foucault and forget Deleuze and forget Sartre, and Sartre was to this. But in their context of their time period, the sheer aura that they commanded, the gigantic mammoth shadow that they cast in France at this time, major figures. When you say Louis Aragon, that's no joke. That is, and he deserves every bit of the reputation. Go read The Self-Dismembered Man. I'm not an enemy of the Surrealists. They were phenomenal in their own rights. Self-Dismembered Man is one of the best poems I've ever read. When you walk into a cafe with Louis Aragon and Breton and these other figures, that's a hell of a lot to ask for 4 19-year-olds to contend with, who have no credibility, who have no legitimacy, who persist simply as a rumor and as a kind of cool flicker of light, that a curiosity on the margins of things. But they don't have a record, they don't have publications, they don't have exhibitions in their honor. Surrealism is a unparalleled dominant force at that moment. They ran the show. And it's hard for us to understand this now also with the fate that has accompanied the art world and the intellectual world. But it's no overestimation to say that Surrealism ran Paris for a while. Everyone knew them. Everyone flocked to their side. So at any rate, this is a lot for them to go up against. So let's continue. Also, they were accused of having some involvement with Artaud's dissident theater, Alfred Jetty, which we'll get into later. To the overtly political, their failure during recent student demonstrations to publish a violent denunciation of the state signed by a group of students from the elite École Normale Supérieure. Okay, this is the first sign of the domino effect of what's going to go wrong. Constantly being called upon to show their political credentials, their political authenticity, which tragically to this day is pathologically and resentfully present in way too many people around me and out there in the ether. Constantly calling people to the carpet to declare their stances, never being, this is the pathological dimension, it will never be pure enough. It will never be authentic enough. There's a tyrannical and totalitarian aspect to this. And I love the fact that Le Grand Jeu at the outset had the instinct, had the, I want to say it's a raw instinct to avoid at all costs, to try and elude at all costs submission to political discourses and to political stances. And all of those, by the way, as happens in our age, in our moment, this will happen. All of those from Sartre to Breton ended up making deals with the devil that were disgusting in the end and revealed to be fatal mistakes, forever trusting that Heidegger made his errors, Sartre threw in line with others. Existentialism fell apart, if those of you don't know. Camus and Sartre had their dividing line when Sartre started supporting Stalin, despite knowing about the gulags, all that. And this lesser of evils kind of inclination that comes from a revolutionary urgency, which I'm sympathetic to, but I also know too well has cancerous outcomes. So at any rate, most damning of all, however, was the accusation that Velin, writing under a pseudonym, had published an article in the newspaper Paris Midi, which was sympathetic to the hated chief of police, Jean Chiappé, the doyen of the far right. Now, this is an intriguing blemish or a weird stain that catches all of them by surprise. It's not confirmed that Velin, who, by the way, when we get to how they all end, René Daumal goes chasing Oriental mysticisms by learning Sanskrit and starting to translate 1,000-year-old documents from Sanskrit and Buddhistic traditions, and ends up sort of a mystic, also chasing Gurdjieff, the famous Armenian mystic of the time period, becoming a disciple of his. And so that's how René Daumal ends with tuberculosis, sadly, at the end of his life. Roger Gilbert Lecomte becomes a morphine addict who ends up dying by jabbing an infected, dirty needle into his leg at age 30, 31, something around that. But Roger Valin, and the other one is, you'll get to, Mirage, who was known as the ghoul, or the most grotesque of the four of them. He becomes a dentist, suburban dentist. Never speaks to any of them again, just goes mainstream. But the interesting one, Roger Valin here, he became one of the most celebrated writers in France. But none of his later writing approximates or emulates anything of the writing of Grand Jeu. And intriguingly, one of the first cracks in the wall of their movement is this gesture where they didn't know for sure. There was an accusation that he wrote under this pseudonym, sympathetic thing, maybe for money, maybe as a kind of weird gesture, sort of unexpected gesture, that he wrote this kind of sympathetic piece on behalf of a police chief. Interestingly, Roger Valin would later be known for having written the most famous anti-fascist novel of the 20th century, and he'll receive the greatest award from the French literary culture for that reason. So he continued to be a writer, but nothing of the type that he experimented with early. Although he did go to Roger Gilbert Lecomte's grave constantly until he died as an old man, the only one of them to die old. Infuriated by the turn the meeting had taken and surmising that it had been planned as an ambush intended to humiliate the members of the Grand Jeu, Ribemont de Sagnet, that's the guy from Dadaism who had a major presence because of his role in Dadaism. He stormed out, bringing the evening's business to an end. A livid Gilbert Lecomte, leaving the bar, tore up the pages of the plans he had intended to propose for the wider group's collective activity. So they went in good faith. That's what this shows, thinking that this was a genuine attempt at some type of truce between surrealism and themselves, only to find themselves at the center of an attack. The evening at the Bar du Chateau would prove to be a significant moment for surrealism. Breton would describe the incident as merely the unmasking of some, quote, harmless little boys. But as Maurice Nadeau puts it in the History of Surrealism, it was not only the editors of Le Grand Jeu who were unwilling to suffer the rigors of an inquisitorial judgment. It was not only Ribemont de Sagnet who asked that there be, quote, a stop put to this testing of hearts and loins. It was all the non-surrealists who, refusing to submit to Breton's demands, preferred to withdraw altogether. Surrealism basically killed itself at this moment. That's not an over-exaggeration. This was such a foul air that Breton created, going after these four young innocents in front of everybody, that all the people he could have brought into surrealism, very powerful figures who were attracted to their movement, suddenly found themselves repelled by this. This may indeed have been the intended effect, since the plea for greater communal activity resulted in something of a streamlining for Breton's surrealism, and the need for a redefinition of the project, which would be marked by the appearance the following year of the second Surrealist Manifesto. Again, Breton was already paranoiacally thinking that his movement had become too incoherent, sort of too loosely entangled with multiple projects, and he wanted to make it mean something cohesive again. For the Grand Jeu, too, the events at the Bar du Chateau were critical for the direction the collective was to take. In his letter of rebuke to Breton following the incident, Ribemont de Sagnet wrote, "There is nothing behind us, or if you prefer, before us. The only door open to us is that of the Grand Jeu." For some, then, surrealism was stalling, and the only feasible new direction lay with the experimental metaphysics and fundamental experiences of the Grand Jeu, whom Breton had just irremediably cut adrift. Having existed on the fringes of surrealism, encouraged and sometimes in collaboration with Breton and his associates, the Grand Jeu was henceforth a truly dissident enterprise, and its mystical leanings, with those references to God which had formed part of the case for the prosecution, not mere inflections on the surrealist formula, but evidence of an approach fundamentally incompatible with the concerns of their more famous rival. Okay, this is an important breaking point then. There's absolutely no in between. There's no meeting ground for them. And again, these are some of the early, this is Gilbert Lecomte when he starts this. You can see just how sort of young they were. This is them, their earliest hours. Mazen Marouf is a contemporary Palestinian poet. He has a 5-line poem I just want to read about, which gives a sense of one's relationship to the enemy. It says, I have a simple dream to make another planet that can house all my enemies. I proceed into it before them and live there temporarily. We nibble its delicious pieces when we are hungry. I think this is an echo of what happens to the Grand Jeu after 1929. They become deeply aware that their creative endeavors are no longer happening in a vacuum, that they're no longer sort of just in this beautiful insular secret society, but that their secret society now must become a spear or a pointed weapon aimed at surrealism and the world. So from that moment of inquisition in the bar to their banishment, and then to the idea of creating something, a world of their own that would also be a place to house and destroy their enemies. We continue. In a letter to Gilbert, now we go back to the beginning. This is now the origin of Le Grand Jeu. In a letter to Gilbert Lecomte, penned 2 years earlier and almost a year before the first appearance of the magazine, Belin had suggested that only the group's inner circle should be allowed to write the extended articles, which were to make up roughly half of each issue. Quote, only we really know the simplest point of view, but in reading these debates, little by little, others will become able to understand. What then was the simplest point of view? So this is important to know. They were first called the simplists, not Le Grand Jeu. The origins of the Grand Jeu lie in the town of Reims in the northeast of France, at the inaptly named Bon Enfants Secondary School, the same school Jean Baudrillard would attend during the 1940s. The 14-year-old René Daumal first arrived here in 1922, his parents having moved to Reims after a peripatetic few years, uprooted by the war and by René's father's work for the Ministry of Finance. Real quick, just in case I didn't do this at the outset, again, this is Roger Gilbert Lecomte, this is René Daumal down here, this is Roger Valin in the middle, and this is Robert Mera on the left. All right. The school year was already underway when the newcomer made his appearance, preceded by a reputation for being something of a swot. I had to look that word up. It apparently means an extremely studious person. Daumal's contemporaries would remember their initial impression that with his long hair, taciturn demeanor, and slightly oriental features, he put them in mind of the Buddha. So this is the appearance of Daumal on the scene. He's the newcomer too. In the year prior to Daumal's arrival, several of the pupils at the school had produced a handwritten review, Apollo, which ran to 6 issues and featured poetry and drawings. The editor was the young Roger Gilbert Lecomte. He would later incorporate the Gilbert into his surname. Assisted by his friends Roger Valin and Robert Mera. It was to this group that the newly arrived Daumal would appeal, highly literate as he was, and immersed in the esoteric and Orientalist writing which had begun to interest them. Many years later, Merat would reflect on the impact of Daumal's arrival in their coterie. Hold on a second. It completely changed everything. We had been nothing more than 3 jokers. René brought our minds together and was the catalyst for the group. He also introduced them to writers they had not encountered before, among them Alfred Jetty. So for those who don't know, Alfred Jetty is often considered kind of this weird, iconic touchstone or origin point for the avant-garde. He was a weird writer of the 19th century, and there are plenty of weird writers. I mean, there's de Nerval, there's L'Autremont, There are the decadents and all of that. But Jetty gets particular attention because he actually staged plays that were highly performative and experimental, one of which being King Ubu, that became the most famous, in which a mad emperor figure was the central character. Jetty was very weird. He wouldn't sit on grass. A lot of little details about him and all that intrigued the avant-garde later. Damal was swiftly integrated into the Apollo group. The boys would meet at Gilbert Lecomte's home or at Marat's grandparents to drink, smoke, and read poetry, with an emphasis on the canon of 19th century poet Madi. Poet Madi, means accursed poets, sort of, right? So Baudelaire, Nerval, Rimbaud, to which they would add verses of their own. Occasionally others would join them, but the group was quickly becoming exclusive, a foursome with its own codes and rights, and even private names for each other. They began to identify themselves as the Frères Simplistes, the simplest fraternity, with frère implying brotherhood, both in terms of the closeness of their friendship and in its sense of spiritual community or friar. Yet in its deliberate misspelling, it also wryly subverted connotations of orthodoxy, looking beyond Christianity. At school, the simplest were skilled classicists and evoking Jarry's similar distortions, for example, finance for finance. Simpliste is a telling term too, and might serve as emblematic of the entire project of the Grand Jeu, indicating a return to a state of childhood simplicity, the belief in a mystical state of unity and thus the rejection of distinctions, for example, between dream and reality. This, by the way, this point here, which Duncan is absolutely correct about, this, I think, is the unconscious threat that Breton perceives from, right? That surrealism is predicated precisely on the distinction between dream and reality. And they are rejecting the distinction and experimenting at a whole different level, where that binary becomes obsolete, but also between the visible and invisible, which were seen as nothing more than social constructs unnecessary acquired. In the group's wordplay, Simpliste also breaks down into Saint Pliste, the patron saint of their private religion. It seems only natural then that they should have posited their own god, who duly took the form of Bubu, a grotesque baby with outsized features and a single tuft of hair pointing upwards like a horn, seemingly modeled on, as well as named after, Jarry's dictatorial stage creation, Père Ubu. So that's King Ubu again. Bubu, by the way, if you look at the first page of the cover of the book, you see them holding the little doll, right? Bubu would become a talisman for the group, invoked in their letters. Bubu, navel of the world, has granted me this vision, quote, and included in the form of a tiny doll in their photographs, see cover. During their time in Reims, the Simplest would produce another short-lived publication, a little review running to 2 issues, entitled Bubu Magazine. Okay. I want to stop for a second there and isolate when we talked about synchronicity, meaning the accumulation of circumstances, of incidental factors that then make possible something this rare and this singular, how much luck is required, how fragile the chain of connections are. Definitely the immense importance given to the arrival of René Daumal. This kid from nowhere, this kid from not their school, the figure of the newcomer. How many religions are formed on this archetype, right? So how many cults are formed on this archetype? How many, so the figure of the newcomer and this catalysis, right, that they talk about, his catalyzing presence, is something that we want to examine. Also, the new relationality to a certain elder or idol in the form of Jetty, right? That the group needed an elder, ghost, they needed an idol of some kind, so an antecedent. And also their worship of writers who were part of an abhorrent tradition, an accursed tradition, right? So beginning first with the recitation, they're only 16, with the recitation, emulation, elaboration of those poetic figures as the first steps of initiation. So I love the fact that they actually follow a classical mystical model in that they start through recitation of the masters. that come before them, even though their masters are the wretched of the earth, are the most discarded, the most despised, the most stained sort of by society. On your left, you have a short poem by the Syrian poet Adonis, who kind of gives you a good sense of the concept of the newcomer in this song, he writes. He comes unarmed like a forest, like a destined cloud. Yesterday, he carried a continent and changed the position of the sea. He paints the back of day and creates daylight out of his feet, borrows the night's shoes and waits for what will not come. He lives where the stone becomes a lake, the shadow a city. He lives and fools despair, wiping out the vastness of hope, dancing for the soil so it can yawn, for the trees so they can sleep. And here he is, speaking of crossroads, drawing the magic sign on the forehead of time. Now, some gorgeous lines by Adonis, but they are also, to those who believe in another false binary between poetry and philosophy, there's also some immense philosophical labor that goes into this. The idea that the newcomer arrives unarmed is a truly crucial idea, because that's actually part of Domal as well. Now, notice they say he's extremely well read, perhaps more than all of them, well versed, but he appears unarmed in the way that he carries himself. The idea that he's referenced as destined, now that's an interesting thing too. Where does destiny come in? When we talk so much about chance and fortune and serendipity and sort of meaningful coincidence, is destiny part of that equation? Yes, it's simply not the overbearing, predominant totalitarian force of overriding that typically it is in mythological and philosophical traditions. Imagine destiny is a force that is allowed in the equation of the Grand Jeu. It's just one of many, which means it doesn't have a guarantee or an exclusivity to it. James, did you have something you wanted to say there? Please.
Yes, the drawing of the magic sign. I'm quite struck by the use of the spiral on the covers of the magazine.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder whatever you can bring to bear.
No,
there.
no, you just brought it to bear. That's perfect. That's a perfect observation. That says it all. They are diagramming, yeah, and inscribing magical signs on the forehead of time. Interesting question. If Nietzsche's ghost were here, he would say, be careful. What time do you mean? Because be careful that we don't mistake this as meaning their time. You know, that they're necessarily consumed with a fight for generational supremacy. That's surrealism's game, right? To dominate their era. Whether or not we want to get into Nietzschean ideas of the untimely, that's a whole different thing. What's actually more interesting than even that necessarily for our purposes here is to see that when we actually read their words, when we actually read their ideas, which is a rare privilege for us to do because almost no one on earth does this. And even Dennis Duncan in the introduction, notice he's making almost no reference to their thinking. I mean, a lot of it's just the variables surrounding their rise and fall, because he has to provide a historical backdrop. But when we get into that, you'll see that they have a strange relationship to temporality that has to do with their concept of the void. Time in the void. Right? So we'll get into that for sure. Those who wait for what will not come. Is that what Le Grand Jeu is? A movement that waited for what will not come, that conjures images of Waiting for Godot by Beckett as well. But 30 years before, it was even an inkling in Beckett's eye. They live where the stone becomes a lake, the shadow a city. That's an intriguing gestural thing of transformation, that they live in full despair. Remember saying that despair is the ultimate criterion of any mirage, and that they wiped out the vastness of hope. Already staring at these images, I place images of them. It's not that I'm overly sentimental, but when I said that they break my heart, it's because you're looking at lost causes in all these photos. In 3 years, they'll all be dead or addicted or institutionalized or not speaking to one another or not writing anymore. You know, so, but there's such ferocity in the look for while it lasted. At any rate, and the crossroads goes back to that question of the fine line or the threshold between their annihilation and their ascendancy, which, by the way, though, may be some secret ingredient for why in the rarest places like here, they also have the power of return, the threshold of return, or the ability of return. So we'll get into that. But these were the three things that we wanted to mention. Now, also, already we've started to look at this. The brotherhood, the idea of brotherhood, which, by the way, I'm going to, in a second, complicate, because it could have been sisterhood. I don't see anything particularly patriarchal about the Grand Jeu in the least, by the way. But the fact that they require rituals, they require pseudonyms, we're going to get into that, and their increasing relationship to exclusivity, secrecy, code languages, letter writing to one another. We're going to get into simplism in a second, but let's just read a little bit further. Where were we? Okay. Where were we? The creation of a religious structure and their own mythology allowed the simplists further to define themselves as separate, distinct from, and entirely unlike the ordinary world around them. The world of schoolwork, exams, and the ubiquitous scaffolding and reconstruction projects of post-war Reims. The simplists envisaged themselves as angels, each with his own personality, but all utterly unworldly. Gilbert Lecomte was the dark angel, the satanic consort. Dalmal, the softly spoken exile from paradise, listening patiently, seeking the miracle of his resumption. Valand, the most earthbound, assimilated, no longer hoping for a return to paradise. Marat, mysterious, neither earthly nor heavenly, but a terror to all. This self-mythologization went beyond mere play. It would govern their relations. They forbade themselves to speak of their physical states, of being hungry or sick. While years later, Dalmal, by then living in Paris and writing to encourage Maurice Henry to join their group, recounted, quote, the discovery that we were angels, agglutinated angels, angel brothers, or perhaps a single angel in 4 bodies. Perhaps the most striking aspect of the simplest private world was the set of names they created for each other. Each member would henceforth be known by a pseudonym or by a number of pseudonyms, reflecting numerous alter egos, which would endure in their correspondence through the group's relocation to Paris and their encounters with the Surrealists. Gilbert Lecomte, handsome, decadent, darkly aristocratic, went by the vampiric rogue Jarl, or sometimes the affected Oriental Coco of Colchis. Dalmal would be Nathaniel, or sometimes Field, i.e. Field's son, to Gilbert Lecomte's papa. Valand became Dada or Francois, while Marat was the Strix, a blood-sucking ghoul that preyed on children. Under the protective shield of their otherworldly collective identity, the simplists began to venture beyond their poetry readings and into some extremely worldly situations. With their sense of being untouchable, exempt from normal moral strictures, they began to frequent the bars, dance halls, and brothels which post-war Reims, with an itinerant workforce swollen by the great spasm of Reconstruction, had to offer. The Cosmos, the Rich Tavern, the Bar du Cirque, or the less salubrious Renaissance and the 151. Beyond these, they took to their carousing to the streets and to the local park, the Jardin de la Patte d'Oie, which backed onto the Cosmos. Okay. At this stage, to understand this idea of what does simplism mean in terms of what does their philosophy of simplicity mean, I want to turn to, hold on a second here, the great Forough Farrokhzad, Iranian poetess of the 20th century, died at identical age to 2 of them, Dalmal and Lecomte, at around 31 years of age, also a figure of lost destinies and lost possibilities. And she too follows or has her own version of this recipe. So if we just follow this poem of hers, she says, I shall wear a pair of twin cherries as earrings, and I shall put dahlia petals on my fingernails. There is an alley where the boys who were in love with me still loiter with the same unkempt hair, thin necks and bony legs, and think of the innocent smiles of a little girl who was blown away by the wind one night. There is an alley which my heart has stolen from the streets of my childhood. The journey of a form along the line of time, inseminating the line of time with the form, a form conscious of an image, coming back from a feast in a mirror. And it is in this way that someone dies and someone lives on. No fisherman shall ever find a pearl in a small brook which empties into a pool. I know a sad little fairy who lives in an ocean and ever so softly plays her heart into a magic flute. A sad little fairy who dies with one kiss each night and is reborn with one kiss each dawn. If you look closely, there's so many of the dimensions of what Le Grand Jeu has to do in order to solidify and seal their secret society are present here as well. Gestures, certain gestures. So we talked again about the necessity of ritual, of pseudonyms, of code languages, simplicity, meaning a return to child kings and queens, like her little fairy, Farrokhzad's little fairy figure, the doll or the automata, return to sort of innocence, neo-mythology, and talismans, right? I shall wear a pair of twin cherries as earrings. These are all talismanic gestures by Farrokhzad, right? And they create a neo-mythology, right, of a young girl who was a little girl who was blown away by the wind one night. Otherworldliness. Notice that they refer to themselves as the dark angel, the vampire, the exile from paradise, the earthbound wanderer, the enigmatic ghoul or strix. Their asceticism, this is key too. How 4 16-year-olds knew these crucial elements of ancient asceticism is beyond me. The refusal to speak of physical illness or hunger. This is something, by the way, that Nietzsche also practices. One of the sickest human beings physically that you could ever imagine. Ravaged by pain, migraine headaches, horrific digestive problems, 3/4 blind, by the end of his life, and yet you would never know it reading his work. So they're also not allowing themselves to, this is monastic, right? Monks also have oaths of suffering, of starvation or fasting, rather, of silence, and you're never supposed to complain of the negativity of it. But also the mixture of their asceticism with their decadence. So the reference to their night excursions, their headquarters, which became their headquarters, roving headquarters, starting at the home of Gilbert Lecomte and Marat's grandparents, then the hotel, the lounge, the bar, the brothel, that are sort of post-war decadent zones for them. And this, again, decadence mirrored in Farrokhzad. She's also a deeply erotic poet in many places, but in this sort of the innocent sense here, you have the reference to the magic flute and the kisses of each night. So you have this decadent overture happening as well in her description of how you create this experience. But now we're going to go a little bit dark with them. For the simplest, entering into the nightlight of Reims went hand in hand with the notion of decadent experimentalism. Valand would relate an incident one winter's night when he and Domal, fueled by absinthe from a bar in town, ingested the poisonous leaves of a spindle tree, before narrating to each other the passage of their mental states as they shifted minute by minute, comparing this to the mystical experiences they had attempted to induce by other means. Domal, meanwhile, through the expedient of his passion for coleoptery, that's, by the way, the study of beetles, the insect, with shades of Dracula's Renfield, had access to carbon tetrachloride, a chemical used to kill beetles and with which the simplest dabbled in auto-asphyxiation, aiming to document the, quote, absurd evidence of near-death experience. See the unutterable experience, pages 175. We're going to read that, obviously. For the same purposes, the debonair Gilbert Lecomte flirted with his science teacher's daughter in order to procure strychnine. By 1925, they had begun to use opium. But the simplest attempts to induce particular mental states were not limited to the use of stimulants. By the way, I would note for all of you that while it was very common for figures of the avant-garde to experiment with what Baudelaire called artificial paradises, right, which is to say drug-induced states. This is very different. Artaud also used opium. Many of other figures tried different experiments with that. But this is closer to only one other figure of that era and that French sort of backdrop, and that would be André Michaud's use of mescaline. So if you ever read André Michaud's trilogy on mescaline, Miserable Miracle, Turbulent Infinity, and I always forget the third, you can see how closely he is studying the alterations, the radical alterations of his language, sensations, consciousness, as he doses himself slightly. And they are using this for those as well. It's not some luxuriation in the illusion of radical freedom that is provided by the drug, which the Beats, by the way, will later tell you is a dead end. Right? When you read figures like Bukowski and others who will tell you that junkies are absolutely the most boring people on earth at the end of their registers. Right? This is not what's happening here necessarily. But the simplest attempts to induce particular measures were not limited to the use of stimulants. Under the guidance of one of their teachers, a philosophy professor, God help him, philosophers, named René Mont-Blanc, the group became interested in paroptic vision, attempting to see objects hidden from view, as in the photograph here of a goggled Daumal attempting to see the contents of the locked box in his hands. They practiced sightless movement too, walking, sometimes running, eyes closed, through the town at night under the direction of another of the frères. Other procedures consisted of looking into a mirror and attempting to focus, not on the reflection, but on the surface of the mirror itself, so that the reflection would become a vague and uncanny presence on the margins of perception, a doppelganger just out of sight. Still other experiments involved using traditional occult or magical techniques for entire original aims. In such techniques, we can see the origins of the experimental metaphysics the group would describe a few years later in Le Grand Jeu, announcing, by the way, what meta means here, since these are so deeply physical gestures, is an intriguing one that I want to save from traditional metaphysics. We're going to describe this later. What they mean by the infinite, and it's a fascinating gesture. I've never seen a movement that is so, other than Sufism, is deeply aware of this. I've never seen a movement that is so consumed by the problematic or the vertigo of our being born into finite consciousnesses in an infinite universe. And how does one then engage or intersect with the infinite, given the finitude of our thought and our perception? Well, that's not a dead end for them. That just means they want to poke holes in the ozone layer of our finitude, in order to allow these leakages of the infinite to take place, right? Which are necessarily, just like in Sufism, going to be episodic experiences, right, of the infinite. But there's more to it that we'll get into about what they mean by that. But that's meta here at some level. In such techniques, we can see the origins of the experimental metaphysics group we'll describe a few years later in Le Grand Jeu, announcing that their methods would be numerous enough to continue surprising their readership, and that the intention of Le Grand Jeu would be to present the means for every mind to achieve the same state of liberation which the group's members had achieved through such perilous means. The young simplest exploration of unusual psychic realms would inevitably come to confront the most mysterious of them all, namely that of death. This became something of an obsession with Daumal and Gilbert Lecompte. Now, hold on one second. So quickly here, the reason I stopped for a moment there is that they started with the idea of near-death experience, right? So rituals or practices of poisoning themselves, auto-asphyxiation, anesthesia, narcotics that would take them right to the cliff's edge, right to the ledge of the building, sort of where they could stare into death. The reason I stopped there is because you notice there's going to be a transition then to near-death experience not being good enough, wanting to actually engage death proper. Like when Kierkegaard beautifully says once, I die death itself. Right? Kant would have never thought death as a thing in itself, by the way. But Kierkegaard's going to go there. And that's what gives him his proper rights as one of the pioneers of what you could call existentialism. But at any rate, there are also these visionary trials that they have to go through. This, if it's going to follow a semi-mystical kind of thing, then there are trials. Nietzsche talks excessively about testing, right? The necessity of testing. So rituals are really trials. Panoptic vision, sightless movement, staring in mirrors. We'll get into that when we read them closely. But just on the right here, you have another Palestinian poet, Sami al-Ghasim, I think 27 years in prison, writes this amazingly strange thing for a political prisoner called The Tragedy of Houdini the Miraculous. So Houdini, as you know, the great escape artist. He writes, "Come and clamp down the manacle's jaws, the slightest of touches, and all your enigmas fall. The end will come through magic, with just a touch of sorrow. My feet ascending toward the world on high, new orbits and calendars. One more touch and again, fascination becomes a sign." Again, how many of these could be epithets of Le Grand Jeu? The end will come through magic with just a touch of sorrow. So we go back. Let's see, where were we? Okay, this was an important one. So then we get to, here we are. The young, simplest exploration of unusual psychic realms would inevitably come to confront the most mysterious of them all, namely that of death. This became something of an obsession with Damal and Gilbert Lecomte, if in different ways. For the somewhat Gothic Gilbert Lecomte, death represented the principal image of a certain dark symbology derived from Baudelaire and Rimbaud. Damal's writing, on the other hand, treated it more as another illusion to be confronted and unveiled. It was a tenet of the group that each member's life belonged unquestioningly in the hands of the others. Damal wrote to Gilbert Lecomte, quote, "If you wanted to kill me, I would not have the right to resist." And it fell to Damal to treat the matter of life and death as a game in the most literal manner possible. By acquiring a revolver and in the park one night, in the presence of the others, playing Russian roulette with it. Mirage was instructed to hold the gun to Damal's head and pull the trigger. The firing pin clicked, and Damal collapsed to the ground in a faint. "I was sure of leaving," he later wrote, "and the ease with which I had taken my departure from the world astonished me." The seeds of the Grand Jeu, that is, of life and death as the great game, were sown on this March evening in the public park of Reims. Gradually, though, with particularly strong chemistry of friendship, these four precocious and somewhat fanatical had gone well beyond the usual adolescent dares. Under Damal and Gilbert Lecomte's direction and influenced by their wide reading, including, of course, Surrealism and its forebears, their preoccupations had coalesced into a mission, albeit one with paradoxical objectives. The simplest fraternity had become an attempt to create a reality for its members that was distinctly otherworldly, while simultaneously undertaking to change the world in which they found themselves. That's a great, I think, encapsulation of some of the paradoxical objectives, as he said, the imperative to be otherworldly while also irreversibly altering the world as they knew it. But then we also go to this idea of their experimental metaphysics, the idea of death. So as Andrew read in a quote that I had put for the description of the seminar, they refer to the universal as a state of intimate emptiness. So the idea that you could touch the void, you could be close to the void, which requires peril. That's a concept you want to get to, mortal risk, fatal proximity, but ultimately it's this quadrangulation: death as mystery, death as a pact, death as a game, and death as a mission. That is the secret behind their absurd fanaticism, which culminates with that night of Russian roulette in the park. So those four again: death as mystery, death as a pact between themselves, death as a game they play, and death as a mission they pursue. And this, just as an echo here, the great Egyptian surrealist poet. And the reason I put a surrealist in here, Joyce Mansour, not only because she's amazing, but because being a woman in the surrealist movement was like being Le Grand Jeu anyway by default, meaning that you were to some extent included, but also feared and exiled simultaneously. So she wrote, "For I must wander on the deep seabed, showering pearls on dead men, gathering shells and sweeping the shadows of passing boats with falling hair across the sliding sands into a mouthful of hell." So a quick sense of the experimental metaphysics that she's talking about. Now, James, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yes, this notion, these filial bonds related to death are very much like the samurai code.
Mm-hmm.
You wouldn't want anyone else to take your life other than a great friend.
Exactly, exactly. No, absolutely. But and it's not necessarily an exception because the samurai code is extremely complex in its own right, for sure. Except that here there wouldn't need to be any governing rationale, in the sense that if one night, Domal says, if one night Gilbert Lecomte decides to kill him, he doesn't need to explain why, or give a reason, or refer to any tradition of any kind. So it's a great connection, but it's even scarier when you see the sheer vulnerability with which they were willing to play, willing to lose everything. For all their, and then now it's Paris, the end of things. For all their self-fashioning, however, it should be remembered that the simplest were still school children, teenagers living at home and studying for their baccalaureates. In the summer of 1925, having passed their exams, Domal and Valland departed for Paris to attend university. Gilbert Lecomte, who did not pass, remained restlessly in Reims under pressure from his father to enroll at medical school. Predictably, his thoughts were with the others in Paris, and his letters to them give a sense of the simplest emerging ambition as not merely a close-knit circle of provincial school friends, but as the artistic and philosophical movement that might augment or even replace a now moribund surrealism. A date, May 17, 1927, settled in Gilbert Lecomte's mind as the focus, the deadline for their endeavors, by which point they would be ready to unleash their ideology on the world. At the beginning of 1926, he wrote to Domal, "My fellow angel, 17 May 1927 is fast approaching. In Paris itself, there will be something enormous in Paris itself. I have a tremendous apocalyptic intuition of it. It is certain that simplism on 17 May 1927 will succeed surrealism, just as that movement did Dadaism. See for yourself how simplism is superior, more beautiful, more anything than surrealism. One day I'll write its manifesto for you. But everything will be ready for the journal. Acts, eternal revolution, our annexation of the surrealists, already outdated in 1924, manifestos, demonstrations. No doubt you too have already sensed the malleability of the external world, a function of its irreality." The letter concludes with a prediction. "Before the year is out, I will be in Paris," and the signature, Rogue Jar. Notice this hunger, this young blood hunger to overthrow surrealism. The interesting thing is, for me, they did, even though that's not history's record or documentation of what happened. They did overthrow surrealism. It's just no one noticed, or only a few noticed. It's a kind of silent victory. In fact, despite his being isolated in Reims, Marat, to the disappointment and confusion of the other frère, had abruptly ceased all communication with his fellow simplists soon after Valland and Domal's departure for Paris. Okay, this is crucial. First, we had the problematic thing that's going to happen with Roger Valland when he writes a pseudonymous, allegedly writes on behalf of the chief of police. But for some reason, Marat, who remember is the most atrocious. He's the one who holds the gun to the head of Domal. He's up for anything. He considers himself the devourer of children. Suddenly breaks all communication with all three of them because he perceives, the idea is, again, because he perceives Domal and Valland's leaving for Paris as a betrayal of the group. But also there's an inkling that he already suspected something deathly at the end of this movement. Remember, he's the one who becomes a dentist, suburban dentist. He's the only one who stays in their hometown. And yet he was supposedly the most ghoulish too. So it was to be Gilbert Lecomte with his striking appearance who would first draw the attention of the Parisian surrealists, attracted by a photograph which the young Pierre Minet, a friend from Reims and Honoré Frère, had shown him, the young Pierre Quinn, who along with this is about the fact that just Gilbert Lecomte looked sort of amazing in his youth, right? So there's Gilbert Lecomte, kind of the vampiric, again, decadent profile of him. Pablo, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I want to ask something a little bit related to
Mhm.
what James had just said about um like the convergence of friendship and the flirting with death. And I
Mhm.
can't help what my question is just I think it's rather a comment. I can't help but to draw these ridiculous parallels between the Great Game, or what we've seen about it thus far, and
Mhm.
a much more like, I guess, superficial or like vulgar, definitely a lot less sophisticated similarity with Jackass, with the dudes from Jackass.
Okay.
It seems like, like, because they're always doing these stupid things,
Dares.
and
Yeah, childish
some of them are
dares.
childish dares, and they're always like fucking with each other. And some of there's some of them that are like very, that could be very dangerous,
For
that
sure.
if it go bad.
Life-threatening.
Yeah, but
They've all
the
broken bones and meant
yeah,
a lot of drug addiction too in their history.
yeah, but and I guess not now, but in like when they started out, like the first seasons and maybe the first movie, the more dangerous the activity would be, the funnier
Mhm.
it would be, and the more you could see them enjoying it. They would get like this pleasure from like putting themselves in danger in the funniest ways possible. So I
Absolutely.
feel like that friendship, that triangle of friendship, death, and like, I guess, excess or like ridiculousness is very like, it's got a lot to do with the Great Game.
It comes down to, and this is a question of how riot crowds form too. You exponentially magnify and irradiate the intensity based on collectivity. You know, sort of. So there's a contagious effect of one upping one another and daring one another. That would be the only thing that's often missing from intensely solitary writers, who I also like Kafka, although that's also a myth. Kafka also had lots of friends, and he ran in his own kind of proto-avant-garde circles. In case you don't know, went to meetings of literary groups in Prague and other places and all that, because they sense that this gives you a kind of energetic circularity. Sort of it keeps spiraling. I'll try this, then you do this, then you do this. That's part of the logic of the avant-garde. It's why, if the historical archetype had been up until then, the lone wolf writer, the starving artist, sort of in the alleys in their own isolation, all of a sudden the avant-garde felt this fanatical need to join ranks and form wolf packs. And it's precisely because they saw that you can accelerate the creative process to more daring heights when you have, another one with you in that exercise. So for sure, that's definitely it. What's going on there? Definitely, it's a worthy parallel. What I wanted to notice just quickly is that when Lecomte writes that awesome letter that, by the end of the year on this date in Paris, we're going to overthrow everything. And he refers to it as apocalyptic intuition, right? That they're an emergent force, that they're the challengers, right? That's an amazing position to have. Anyone in the fight game can tell you that too. The worst thing to do is to win the championship title, because all you can do is lose the title. You become conservative, you become paranoid, you become neurotic. It's pure anxiety to fight. But when you're on the upswing, right? So they're out for blood. And I want you to notice their reference to pure irreality as a counterpoint to surrealism. So we talked about one of the distinctions of that philosophically being surreal still requires a dichotomy between real and unreal, whereas irreality just takes everything as sort of neither condition. Nietzsche will have a similar philosophical premise with depth and surface. That he says in the Gay Science, if you annihilate the idea of depth, meaning Socratic and Platonic truth, and all that, then what are you left with? The surface? He says, no, the surface also then gets annihilated as a concept, right? So that's one idea there. But also then again, the idea of the finite consciousness within the infinite. And the infinite for them is the chaotic, is chaos. But nevertheless, it also goes back, and I love this commentary from a friend of mine, Dejan Lukic, who noted this when he started looking into the ancient ideas of apeiron by Anaximander, Empedocles, figures like that, who were the first to really write about the infinite, that they used the term to mean the unfinished. Not that without finitude, but that which is unfinished, meaning that we are in an unfinished world and an unfinished game. And so that moves perfectly with the idea of the great game, that it's a game that hasn't finished yet. So to the right, you have another Palestinian poet who simply says this that sounds like apocalyptic intuition in a poem where he writes, "The one who held me like an oracle." He says, "The one who will come has come, and I used to observe him from my black hideouts. He's walking toward them toward him. Like a deep carving, he clarifies his secrets as he walks." A little bit of the apocalyptic intuition there, but let's quickly run through, because I want to get to the weird form of introduction. So I'm just going to read very fast at this point. So Mirage starts talking to them. At the same time, the group was expanding. Seeing their shared interest in occult studies, Pierre Quint had introduced Damal to André Roland de Renneville, 5 years his elder, who would in turn join the group. Maurice Henry too, then an art student in Cambrai, began a correspondence with Damal and Velan, with Damal writing to urge him to join them in Paris at his earliest opportunity. When you're going to war in Paris, you better bring allies. So they start to recruit. That also is a problem. The recruitments are, you want powerful figures. Well, powerful figures are older than you are. So they're not the young boys that we met. And they're also going to bring their own baggage, their own suppositions, and their own second-rate intimacy. They're going to upset the chemistry. With Damal writing to urge him to join them in Paris' earliest opportunity. Meanwhile, the group also met the Czech poet and journalist Richard Weiner, who introduced them to the countryman, the painter Joseph Simo, with whom an immediate affinity was struck. The young photographer Arthur Harfot came into their orbit too, and the expanded group began to meet weekly at Simo's studio on the left bank. The year 1927 proved to be extremely active for the group, despite Velan suffering a short period in hospital following an overdose of opium. These are all signs, by the way, signs that they themselves could not notice. And Damal experiencing a brief relapse into addiction. While Gilbert Lecomte's May 17 deadline passed uneventfully, the idea of a journal came to be much discussed, and a title suggested, La Voie, the path, implying the transformative mysticism of the simplest approach. In a long letter to Gilbert Lecomte that August, Velan argued against the idea of creating a manifesto for the group. This is crucial. Velan brilliantly suggested no manifesto. Straight away, that imposes limits. Since simplism is not a theory either of literature or of philosophy, but a particular way of looking at life, of living, the journal must be more than just a literary review. Velan's proposal was that each issue should contain an extended study on a simplest theme, revolt, for example, where different members would respond to the same subject, thereby introducing a wider readership to the varied aspects of the simplest concerns. This would take up 30 pages, and then they start talking more and more about that. As for the journal's tone, Velan argued that their task would be to make themselves distinctive from the Surrealists, with whom he noted they were clearly rather close. Thus, they should be less acerbic, abstaining from attacks on religion, even finding affinities with the mysticism of the established faiths. Politically, although communism accorded most with the spirit of simplism, they must resist being drawn into an unquestioning affiliation with the party. When the simplest journal finally appeared in June 1928, it is striking just how closely it resembled Velan's template. The name, however, had changed. Also at Velan's suggestion, it was no longer La Voix. The cover now bore the title, which would supplant simplism as the name by which the collective would be known to posterity, Le Grand Jeu. The first issue attracted a small number of positive notices in other publications, notably though somewhat incestuously, a glowing review from Pierre Quint in Nouvelles Littéraires. On the whole, however, it was either passed over in silence or possibly worse still, patronized as another upstart literary venture. It's a problem when you're young, it's condescension. All right, the second issue, therefore, bristled with scorn at those who had misunderstood its ambitions, both in an opening editorial and in the review of reviews section, in which Damal and Gilbert Lecomte responded to their critics. Now we get some venom towards their critics. In November 1928, as the group were working on material for the second issue, they were joined by the Yugoslav poet Moni de Bulli, a defector from Breton Surrealists. So now this is a crucial move. They stole somebody from Breton's camp. Right? His parting shot, quote, "I no longer wish to collaborate on a review which lives off the corpse of Dadaism. had incensed Breton, stoking feelings of rivalry towards the Grand Jeu and helping to precipitate the showdown at the Bar du Chateau a few months later. The relationship between the Grand Jeu and Surrealism did not end with the incidents of March 11, 1929, and far from being derailed by the rift with Breton, work continued on issue 2. Previously, Breton and Aragon had begun to approach members of the Grand Jeu individually in an attempt to lure them into Surrealism proper, while simultaneously undermining the Grand Jeu as a collective. This is the divide and conquer strategy. First to be approached was Renneville, asking to collaborate. Then Domal was sent a telegram warning his friend that collaboration would be madness. This is the divide and rule idea that they're after, while at the same time urging Domal to defect to the Surrealists. That's why Domal, by the way, then writes the open letter to André Breton, in which he told him to go to hell, basically. The keynote of this letter is the indissoluble unity of the Grand Jeu as a group and the futility of attempting to lure its members away. And yet, for all the talk of solidarity, and after refusing to disown him in the face of Breton's attack, Velan's position within the group had been fatally undermined by his inexplicable act of collaboration with the right-wing regime. Okay, so he gets destroyed for that, and everybody in the Avant-Garde is demanding that Velan be kicked out of Le Grand Jeu. And in 1930, Domal revealed that he and Gilbert Lecomte had forced Velan's withdrawal, insisting that he must declare his retirement publicly in the journal. Okay, that way we'll no longer consider ourselves obliged on principle, which was becoming rather painful, to defend him from anyone or to have to answer for his actions and opinions as if they were somehow representative of the group. Velan's only contribution, remember, Velan was the person who said no reference to the political whatsoever. And yet he wrote this weird short piece in defense of a chief of police and gets him exiled from Le Grand Jeu. His only contribution, Velan's only contribution to issue 3, therefore, took the form of a joint statement signed by Gilbert Lecomte, Domal, and himself, declaring the cessation of his involvement with the group until certain mutual incompatibilities were resolved. The old solidarity of the simplest school friends who had placed their lives in each other's hands was starting to come apart in the crucible of the capital's artistic and political conflicts. Meanwhile, Gilbert Lecomte had succumbed to a crippling morphine addiction and a cycle of hospitalization, detox, and relapse. He was tended by Domal, who wrote to Renneville, "I never leave Roger, and it is a continual maddening struggle against the monster." On November 9th, 1930, Domal experienced a life-changing encounter with the artist Alexander de Salzman. Salzman was a disciple of the spiritual teacher G.I. Gurdjieff, and his wife was one of the principal teachers of Gurdjieff's thought. Fascinating figure if you guys want to look into him. Over the next year, Domal grew closer and closer to the de Salzman, seeing in Gurdjieff the mystical path he had been attempting since adolescence to forge for himself, and seeing also perhaps a replacement father figure for the declining Papa, Gilbert Lecomte. During this period, too, Domal became the lover of Vera Milanova, formerly the wife of the Dutch poet Andre Kramer, with whom he would spend the rest of his life, marrying her in 1940. He returned to his family in Reims until the following spring. The material for issue 4 of Le Grand Jeu had been ready since early in 1931, but the journal failed to appear for lack of funds and the constant pressure of looking after Gilbert Lecomte. At the beginning of 1932, the Aragon Affair blew up. For those who don't know, this is where Louis Aragon wrote a poem advising people to kill police. And he was imprisoned for it, and everyone in the avant-garde came to his defense, except Le Grand Jeu. Interesting. Polarizing the Parisian literary stuff. Louis Aragon's poem Front Rouge, with its exhortations to kill the cops, comrades, kill the cops, and open fire on Léon Blum, had brought upon its author a charge of incitement to murder. For writers on the left, allied with those opposed to literary censorship, the poem became a unifying cause. Petitions were signed for the repeal of the charges against Aragon, while the poem and Aragon's right to write it was defended robustly against its critic. Go down though, and you'll notice that one of the new members of Le Grand Jeu wrote something against the poem. And he was urged by Domal to publish a retraction of the article and issue an unambiguous statement of support for Aragon. Renneville refused, and he too resigned. Still hoping that another issue of Le Grand Jeu would finally appear, Domal wrote to Gilbert Lecomte in Reims, "What we need to avoid with issue 4 of Le Grand Jeu is giving the impression of a group falling apart." Gilbert Lecomte's response was splenetic but clear-sighted. Quote, "With these accounts of idiotic disputes and revolutionary activity, Don't you realize that the Grand Jeu is fucked irremediably? His choice of the term irremediablement recalls with bitter irony the opening sentence of the journal's first issue. That's the one that Andrew read for us, where he says, the great game is an irremediable game. Nevertheless, the impact of the Aragon Affair on the Grand Jeu, the dispute over Renneville's tenability in the group, played out over a good few months. Damal, who had always been close, had urged his friend to reconsider his resignation. He accepted the resignation of two other figures, Delon and Odar, over this. And then it goes on and on and on. It starts getting worse and worse. It would have meant, when asked for this figure, Renville, why he wrote that poem, it would have meant me writing a eulogy for Aragon's poem, and he ends up leaving the group as well. And then the final gesture of them all, Gilbert Lacombe, my favorite, left behind in Paris, threw his lot in with Breton and the Surrealists, and joined them. So Gilbert Lacombe signs his name to the Surrealists, and its stand against Breton was at an end. He does this sarcastic, by the way. He does this as a death sentence, final death knell to Le Grand Jeu, because he knows it's over. Following the dissolution of the group, Harfo and Henri both joined the Surrealists, the others joined as well, and later formed a partnership writing screenplays. Henri also became an exceptionally famous cartoonist. For Damal, the remaining years of his life were defined by his relationship to Gurdjieff and his teachings, with forays into speculations. These are the last two images of both, by the way. With forays into speculations about pataphysics. Jean Baudrillard also very interested in this, and many others. The science of imaginary solutions, elaborated by Alfred Jetty. He ends up writing a lot of things about arcane mystical things. Gilbert Lacombe published 2 volumes of poetry. Oh, and the most famous work, by the way, Mount Analog. The Mount Analog, that's a very famous book by Damal. It's an unfinished novel, but it's exceptional. And it ends mid-sentence because he didn't finish it. He ends up getting tuberculosis in 1939, exacerbated by his youthful experiments with carbon tetrachloride, and 5 years later, on May 1944-21, he dies. And that's the last image of René Damal. Gilbert Lacombe published 2 volumes of poetry with a rare preface by Artaud and a handful of pieces in journals. The decade after the dissolution of the Grand Jeu saw him caught in a downward spiral of addiction and arrest, played out in increasingly insalubrious lodgings, that means run down, around Montparnasse. Rejected finally by Damal in 1934, he met Ruth Cronenberg, a German Jew who would live as his wife, supporting him and herself in their shared addiction until her arrest and deportation to Auschwitz by the Nazis. On New Year's Eve 1943, Gilbert Lacombe died of tetanus, contracted from a dirty needle, and was buried in Reims. Of the other, Simplice Velan was to have what was most closely resembled a conventional literary career. Again, he becomes a famous writer, maintaining an image as something of a dandy. With money and steady work, his dedication to opium did not present the same problems for Velan as it did for Gilbert Lacombe. Okay, he wins awards. His fiction is taken seriously, and it was Velan too who would reveal finally the fate of Merat, the schoolboy Simplice who held a gun to Damal's head and pulled the trigger, but turned his back on their Parisian adventure. Lastridge had trained as a doctor and remained in Reims, paying his respects each week at the grave of his former friend, Gilbert Lacombe. And that's the end. So we look at the reasons behind it for their exhaustion or collapse. Internal fragmentation, when one of their members starts talking to them. Conspiracy, you could say, from the outside, when surrealism is conspiring to destroy them. Betrayal in the form of Roger Velan's writing of a pseudonymous piece out of nowhere on the police chief. Suicidal addictions, that's with the case of Gilbert Lacombe. Pataphysical madness, that's with René Damal chasing mystical gurus into the mountains. Futile surrender, that's again Lacombe at the end. Disease, that's both of them, tetanus and tuberculosis. Hospitalization, arrest, and early death. And 2 quick sentences then, or 2 quick little pieces by Adonis again, the Syrian poet. A mirror for the 20th century. He writes, a coffin bearing the face of a boy, a book written on the belly of a crow, a wild beast hidden in a flower, a rock breathing with the lungs of a lunatic. This is it. This is the 20th century. Some way I think that encapsulates the spirit of their movement, but also this too. when I said that this topic breaks my heart and makes me sad, I think of this Adonis poem where he writes simply, they arrived naked, broke into the house, dug a hole, buried the children, and left. So we are staring at the graves of 4 dead children too at the end of this movement. All right, then. I want us to, or I want to stop there. And then I want to open the floor. Now that we know these figures with some intimacy, and I can't wait for us to read them closely and to see what amazing things they composed in that short time. My way of asking for introductions today, then, other than I know most of you, but say, obviously, you can introduce yourself. But I would like to posit the challenge that if we could time travel, all of us, and we could visit Le Grand Jeu, the 4 young members of it, in one of those back alley bars or absinthe taverns or the park that midnight, if you could ask them a single question, what would it be? That's the way I would like you to introduce yourself. What single question would you like to ask them? There's no right answer to that. There's just a curiosity of you have one chance to meet them, and you're sitting at the table with these 4 16-year-olds who are on the verge of something stunning and something stellar, but something also fatal. What question? You all have read 1,000,000 pages of philosophy, 1,000,000 pages of poetry. If you watch films, you've looked at great art. It should be the easiest and hardest thing in the world for me to ask you this. What question would you ask them if you only had one question? Anyone can start.
I mean, hearing everything, all I can think of is this question actually. I want to ask them was it worth it?
That's a really great question. Yeah. The interesting thing there, Joe, is whether or not you might get different answers from the 4 of them. And we know what the penalties were. We're still not exactly sure what it is, meaning what they did. Did they themselves feel like they made it? When you say, was it worth it? It kind of means, did they make it? And for me, in the most brilliant sense of the term, they absolutely did. They pulled it off. They worked a miracle. But again, the depletion of them is something that is tragic in a certain way and sorrowful. So yeah, it's a great question. Was it worth it? Wow. We could speculate. Let's keep that in mind for later in the semester. Once we're halfway through, remind me of that question, because then we can answer that. I mean, we can try and answer that, but that's a devastatingly judgmental position for us to put ourselves, to ask whether their madness and their early deaths were worth it just to do this. But all right, excellent. Thank you so much. Where are we going next? Who has another question? It can be anything. Pablo, go ahead.
Yeah, I would ask them if there's a specific reason why they remain where they are, or I guess what my question for them would be, why don't you leave Europe? Like maybe whatever it is that you're looking for, do you think could be found outside of where you're most familiar culture-wise, and specifically outside of Europe?
Pablo, that's a brilliant suggestion. Too bad they didn't know you back then. You know that the women surrealists did that. They all went to Mexico. Leonora Carrington went to Mexico. Remedio Varos went to Mexico. All the best of them went to Mexico. Colquhoun, Ethel Colquhoun, all these strange surrealist women who felt like Paris was suffocating them and not allowing them to rise in the ranks. And Joyce Mansour, who I quoted, she's from Egypt, goes to Paris, ends up going to London to avoid the atmospheres of Paris. So I think it's actually a great question. What would have happened if they had taken their show on the road or taken their game to other locales? Antonin Artaud also goes to Mexico, one of the only trips he took in his life outside of France. Went to Mexico, met some shamanic figures there, experimented with some visionary substances. Also went to Ireland famously and believed he found this walking stick of Jesus Christ and tried to give it to a guy at a bar, and that got him didn't speak a word of English. So it was very problematic, and the police were called. He was escorted back to Paris where he was institutionalized again. But that is a great question. What if they had left? What if they didn't think that they had to bend to the center of the universe in Paris? If they had gone to, Rimbaud does this. Rimbaud leaves France and goes to Egypt, you know, for a while. So this is a great question. Man, again, I wish you were there. Pablo, you could have given them some good advice and told them to get out for a while. Nice. I guess the question you might have asked is, why was it unthinkable for them? And they're thinking about transcendent, sort of universes. Why couldn't they think of just getting out of there?
Yeah, like why wasn't it even a possibility? I thought of the question because I haven't read it myself, but I heard recently someone say that Giorgio Agamben said that for history to continue, Europe must end. And I don't know if when he says Europe, he means what's come to be known as, the West.
Yeah.
But I think maybe they were getting at a similar question, like how do we make history continue?
There's not a trace of nationalism. Definitely, they seem to have some affinity for their town, because it's kind of a place that they can carve strongholds. It's off the radar. They can find dark quarters. They can, and there's some beautifully sentimental fact that their intimacy was born in that town. But they're not nationalistic in the least. They're not identitarian in the least. There's nothing particularly French about them. They're as intrigued by again, Sanskrit and Buddhist and mystical writings from other parts of the world. Why they couldn't bust out, all I would say is, again, when we talk about epocality, notice everybody's going to Paris. So how many of the other figures said the Bulgarian photographer so-and-so, the Hungarian poet so-and-so? Anybody who thought that it was, and there are these, at times in history, New York had a gravitational pull. At one point, London for the Romantics had a gravitational pull. There's Berlin, up until recently, has had a gravitational pull of some kind. There have been moments in different places. Tokyo had its moment, in time. And then Paris was just this center of the universe in many people's mind. If you were doing anything creative or intriguing, you went there. And so I guess it would have been considered counterintuitive, like who leaves Paris in the 1920s and 30s, in that era of productivity. You could literally walk into a cafe in Paris, you go in the Deux Magots, the Two Maggots Cafe, and see Beckett at one table, Dali at another, Picasso at another, Jean-Paul Sartre and Camus at another, is ridiculous. Just the overflow of a community of thinkers and experimental artistic figures at that time. So I guess, yeah, they maybe would have survived if they had done the unthinkable and moved away from that tidal wave. But it was a false utopia concealing their dystopia, for sure. Excellent point. Mrs. Slav, go ahead, please.
Thank you. So considering the fourfold concept of death that you have mentioned, death as mystery, death as pact, death as a game, and death as mission, I perhaps would have asked them, was death a stake in a game, or death has been what is at stake? So did they put a stake on a death to lose properly, as they have said, or the game, the death was what they are about to gain in this game, something like that?
I like that. That's really good. How death configures in the game. Is it the reward sort of at the end of the game? Is it is it the sort of championship sort of medal that you get, or is it the very method of how to play the game?
Yes.
Blanchot has a really phenomenal distinction between death and dying. The dying, he says, and he's much more interested.
The art of dying, yes.
Yeah. He's much more interested in the art of dying, exactly. And so absolutely, this is a It's a great question. Remember that, because I think we're going to get some answers, even at the outset in the next week, of how death is a technique, is a tactic, is a rule of the game, is also the end game at times. It's weird. That means it may have multiple components or multiple faces in the game. Interesting thing too is that when you're playing Russian roulette, who are you playing against or with? So death as a player of the game too sometimes.
Or as master.
And death loses that one in that night with Doma. In a sense, that's the interesting thing, that death could lose that game that night. He didn't click the bullet, in the chamber. So that's a great question. Awesome. Thank you so much. Khashar, what did you want to say?
Hello. Well, the thing is, my relationship with everyone that you speak of is that I am always infinitely more interested in what you say about them than them themselves. And I wanted to say, it's really I have explored 5 of your classes. I do not care about Bataille or Nietzsche or any of the people you explore. I love what you say about them. And because of that, I want to put that question to you of what you would have asked.
What I would have asked. I've asked them many things over time. I'm gonna answer that, but I'm going to answer that in 2 months at the end of our session together, in the form of a written piece, which is precisely the answer to what I have asked. So you'll see that, and that'll be a small gift back to all of you. And I thank you for the gracious words. I do try to make these figures as enticing and enlivening. I owe them a lot. And so the only thing I can do is to try and reinvent them in ways. So I appreciate that, even if you don't like them as much in and of themselves, that you like the way we dance with them. Well, then help me with that then. Help me make them even more fascinating than they actually were for the semester. And I promise you that at the end, I'll show you the question that was so crucial.
Actually, in that case, I was wondering if I can ask a short question and also
Sure.
make because one thing is my question is whether I'm not sure if I'm right, but you showed about 5 or 6 small poems embedded in text, and I was wondering if they were from Insurgent Poet Mystic Sectarian.
Yeah, yes, those were from that book, exactly.
Okay.
From the last 2 chapters, which are the only chapters you need to read. The whole book is an excuse to get to the final 2 chapters.
Yes, yes.
But Hajar, I was gonna say something to you, which is a question you could ask me then is, did I ever try anything like this? Which is to say, did I ever try to start a movement or have a group of friends? And I did. And part of the question that I asked them is why we failed. And one of our 4 of us as well. Way before I ever met this group or knew anything about them, I was 21 and I met 3 people. One took his own life, another one completely went in a different direction, and one of them is Dejan Lukic, who I mentioned from time to time, who's taught for the New Center. And he and I didn't speak for 5 years in our 20s because of the dissolution of that group, because we thought we were going to conquer the world too. It was beautifully delusional and idealistic. And man, we were good for a year. So one of the questions that I did ask them, it's not the question, but one of the questions I did ask them is, why did we lose? And they helped teach me that.
Well, I was going to say a couple of things, just a couple small things, which is that I wanted to say, you you covered a few Adonis poems, and all of them are from the manuscript
Victims of a Man.
And when Khaled Matawa came to Toronto for the launch of it, Khaled Matawa was
the translator,
was nominated for the Griffin, which is a Canadian. And in the reading, he was talking about how Adonis was reading and translating T.S. Eliot and Song of Myself by Walt Whitman,
Mhm.
and that starting the modernist movement in Arabic literature. But where was I going? Oh, your sector.
Mhm. Oh, the fact that those excerpts, those poetic excerpts, are from that book.
I'm really sorry. I lost my.
No,
where I was
that happens to me all the time too. Again, that means you're onto something. It means that the sorcerers didn't want you to connect the thought, so they they derailed it. If it comes back to you though, feel free to jump back in with it then.
Yes. And also to briefly intervene, if it does not come to you within this session, if you are in the New Center Discord, I invite you to absolutely post the thoughts that you have on there. Even if it's literally just a kind of resonances that you have, any activity is better than no activity. So feel free to, if you're unable to get through it this session, because we do have a bit of a time crunch because we're in like the last half hour, although we can extend a little bit over since we started a bit late, then more than welcome to go ahead and add that to the Discord and the Google Classroom as well, once you get that assembled.
Absolutely, and Andrew's going to keep me honest this semester, reminding me to go check that. So I'll make appearances there and I'll answer what I can. Edna, go ahead. Nice to see you.
Hi, Jason. Hi, everyone. Okay, I would like to ask them if they really discover something, let's say, transcendental or out of the ordinary or out of this world in their experiments. I guess through the drugs they did, but in other moments, like with the thing staring at the mirror or all that kind of experiments, what they discover.
It's a great question, and I will only answer on their behalf vaguely, and then they'll answer. They absolutely were convinced that they did, that they opened doors that saw into different dimensions of possible experience. It's just when they got there, it wasn't anything of what they expected. So it wasn't enlightenment, it wasn't perfection, it wasn't God. The universe looked a lot colder than what they anticipated.
So you thought like they discover, let's say, demons instead of virtue?
Yeah. I mean, there's. I'm waiting for somebody to make another, like Pablo's connection to that show of juvenile delinquents. I was looking for someone to say this is kind of like Flatliners, the movie Flatliners. If you've ever seen that, those are these 4 doctors who keep killing each other, and they bring themselves back to life because they want to see what's on the other side, and they see demons on the other side, And so it was in 1980s when I was a child. It came. I probably shouldn't have watched it at that age, but anyway, it's a great question, and actually you keep us honest on that, because when they start describing that, point it out, and because again they were surprised by the intimate emptiness that they experienced, like I said. And so they did get somewhere. It's just somewhere was not anything of what they would have expected for transcendence, what transcendence should look like or feel like. And they can be very descriptive, which I like, that it's not just completely left to kind of vacant terms, but they get actually very descriptive when we get there, and the interesting thing too is when we read Gilbert Lacombe's own writings in This Book is a Ghost. The reason this book is a ghost is because they are covered in that transcendence. And so when they come back, it condemns them to a certain ghostliness as well. So it's cool, very cool. Awesome question. Thank you. Andrew, can you see somebody else? Anybody else with a hand, with a question?
Yes, Pablo wants to comment on something. After that, I'll start calling people out that aren't raising their hands, hiding in the corners. I see you.
I just have a quick one. I'm wondering maybe if, because of the name of the game, the concept of play and of game of like childlike behavior, I'm wondering if they were readers of Nietzsche.
All right, so this is a definitely good question. So, all right, let's the elephant in the room, which is an interesting one, is that a movement that has gotten a resurgence of interest recently is Acephale, Bataille's secret society. And for good reason, brilliant thinkers involved in that. My God, Pierre Klosowski is a genius. Roger Calois is a genius. Michel Léry is a genius. And Bataille himself is a force to be reckoned with like no other. So these are, and they met up. But I want you guys to realize that Acephale is a nicely mythologized, beautiful idea. They had some ideas of doing a human sacrifice. They met a few times. Even Walter Benjamin went to a couple of their meetings and was like, okay, it's cool, it's interesting. But it was highly intellectual, mostly literary, and the rituals that they came up with, and they're like 1/1000th as provocative as the Grand Jeu. And no, I'm not taking shots at anybody here, but nothing else, not even that 1990s thing that a lot of you guys are into, that CCRU. Are you kidding me? Not even within kilometers of Le Grand Jeu in terms of content, or in terms of style, or in terms of originality or complexity, or just sheer radical ambition and daring. They were testing death every night, you know, in all kinds of ways. And so the interesting thing is, why did those two get so much radio play and nobody's ever heard of these? You know, and that's going to be an essential question. But the reason I brought that up, Pablo, is because the member of Bataille's Acephalic Secret Society, Roger Calois, he wrote, for me, the only and the ultimate philosophical work on games. I mean, I wrote a book called Man Play Games, in which he isolates 4 game types: games of skill, game of chance, games of role playing, and games of sensation. And I've mentioned this, so I'm not going to bore everybody because I mentioned this in a lot of places and all of that. Games of skill are like chess, games of chance are like the lottery, games of role playing are like video games or costume party or a masquerade, and games of sensation are like cliff diving or skydiving or, you know, hang gliding and stuff like that, right? The interesting question then is, what kind of game is the great game? Le Grand Jeu, what is it? A game of skill? Is it a game of chance? Is it a game of role playing? Is it a game of sensations? And the answer is that it's all 4, which is what makes it so intricate and what makes it so devastating, is that you have to somehow master all 4 game typologies simultaneously. You're playing 4 games at once, and suddenly you could be skilled, but chance could undo you. And by the way, most gambling games do that. Most gambling games in a casino are a combination of skill and chance. That's what makes them addictively exhilarating. You can be an expert blackjack player, but you still have to get the cards, right? And so this is a similar kind of thing with them. But it's interesting to see when in their writings that they will have to switch game methodologies, when they know that only luck will afford them entrance to the next level, or when a certain type of skill is necessary. And then you can break down all those concepts. Skill meaning what? Meaning intelligence. You know, Reza, my friend, is your friend, he's obsessed with the Greek notion of natis, with cunning, right? Well, cunning is only one form of intelligence, but he himself will explore other types of intelligence and artificial intelligence and things like that. So when we say, what kind of skill do you need? Well, skill could be intelligence, skill could be speed, skill could be versatility at some levels. And so let's actually do the work when we're reading through them of seeing what allows them to get from stage to stage, phase to phase of their game. It's a great question. All right. Who else has a cool question? Can be anything.
But did they read Nietzsche?
Oh, I'm sorry. You asked if they read Nietzsche.
Yeah.
Almost definitely, I would say. Almost definitely. Although I would note that they are also about 10 years before Bataille and their secret society. And the reason I bring that up is historically, Nietzsche was an unwelcomed author up until the 1930s. So if their main readings are happening in the 20s, it's not that nobody had read Nietzsche. It's that Nietzsche was dismissed and discarded in the European tradition, really until the 30s. People read him, but it was not cool to read Nietzsche until the 30s, because he was considered a flowery poet, you know, an irresponsible philosopher and all that stuff. But so actually, in terms of the timing, if they did read Nietzsche, they didn't read him as Nietzsche in the grandiose sense of what he became as a legendary philosophical member of the pantheon. They read him in the correct way, which is as, again, a member of the abhorrent tradition, as a poet maudit, as an accursed poet, which is cooler than the reverence that was later shown, perhaps. Remember, Heidegger is writing his 4 volumes on Nietzsche in the 30s. Freud had read Nietzsche, but wouldn't admit to it very often in the 20s. So again, it's this tension of Nietzsche's in the air. People are reading it, but it's not acceptable at that point in the canon. Great, come on, who else has got another intriguing? Go ahead. Hey, Paige, nice to see you.
And nice to see you too. I'm so excited to be in this seminar with you.
Same here.
The first question that came to mind for me is, are there ways for this work to be sustained? And, you know, sustaining might mean like a consistency of metamorphosis or change, or whether that's indeterminism, risk, all of these things. And then if there's this play between life and death, would that also mean, would sustaining mean beyond life, beyond one's own lifespan? And then the question that naturally followed that was it meant not to be? Like, was this made to die, or, you know, to end or something, where maybe, not that there's a goal, but maybe it would be more fitting down the pathway that it had to end in a certain way.
Paige, you know, this you asked 7 questions in one, because no, because they're all, when we say how could it be sustained, it's a question for us of what we're doing in 2022, reading them now. How are we sustaining them? How are we carrying on the game? If it's not just an object of neutral analysis, if we're trying to play and throw dice with these young fellows, then what does that mean for us? You know, exactly. Are there ways in which it can, is it destined, like you said, sort of to not be sustainable? Does it have to be this ephemeral, again, meteoric phenomenon that then just burns out of its own energy and its own volition? The interesting thing is when they start devising code names and nicknames for themselves, which is to say, opening windows to alternative moods of their own identity. Are there any rustlings? Are there any hints that any of their alter egos are aware that they are on borrowed time already? Is there any sense or predilection of doom in their early writings? And you can clarify this, because you're the one who asked the great question. So you're responsible to seeing if there was some hint or intuition or anticipation anywhere, way before Gilbert Lecomte declared we're done. You know, we're over. And he does the death signature by signing to surrealism, just to say we lost. Way before that, did he know at the beginning? So is there anything in his stare? My suspicion, and that's what breaks my heart, is no. They really thought this would be eternal. They really thought it would last forever. They really thought that they were doing something that just was a whole existence. You know, I think it just took them by such shock how quickly they deteriorated and unraveled, and how vulnerable they were to the everyday. While they were spiraling at those heights, they were being dragged down, and they didn't feel the gravitational pull, you know, of the evil of banality. And so that's what kind of makes me saddened sometimes when I write them, is that they just think they're on the moon. And meanwhile, we know, like in a horror movie, that we know what's about to come around the corner. We know where this is going. But I could be wrong. It could be that when they access some of those alternative modes of consciousness, that there are whispers there of saying this isn't going to last, and it shouldn't last. Maybe it's not meant to last, like you said. That's a great question. Please trace that for us. Please be the oracle to that question going forward.
Will do.
All right, thank you so much. Noah, go ahead, please.
Hey everyone. I'm really just interested in why they felt the need to write at all and what the relation between the ritual and their writings are, and kind of how they would view like the gregarious nature of the journal with their individual and intersubjective connections that were very, drawn down to the four of them, and then like opening up and kind of basically all of that. I would just like to see what they thought about that.
It's an amazing question. This type of intimacy I've seen again in certain traditions of mysticism. So the poet Maulana Rumi, the famous Persian mystical poet, he met a figure. He encountered a figure who was an elder to him, but perfect interlocutor, named Shams of Tabriz. And Shams of Tabriz didn't write anything. Rumi wrote tons of poetry, kind of like Plato and Socrates in a sense. But Rumi wrote things that Shams had said to him, and he would give him credit and say, this poem is inspired by him. This poem is something that he told me in a midnight conversation. But Shams himself didn't feel the need to write. And so that is a crucial question. Would they have been better off if they didn't write it? If they had just kept moving and acting and gesturing and performing and daring, and they had not bothered to inscribe things in writing. You see Valan's fear that if they write a manifesto, that will spell the destruction of their movement, right? And that's to some extent what happened with Surrealism and the other avant-gardes, who also have a short life. None of them last more than a decade or two, right? So this is a crucial question, but I would say this. Writing can also be the reason why that intimacy doesn't exist. So someone in the chat, and this is again one of the first times I'm ever looking at chat, sorry, I'm very bad at that, but someone in the chat mentioned someone who I have had meaningful coincidence with, Eugene Thacker, right? Last time I saw Eugene was in New York City, maybe 5 years ago. Hung out with him just one-on-one in some cafe, talked for 2 hours, had amazing conversation, got up, hugged him, said goodbye, let's stay in touch, and we both knew that that was a lie and meaningless. There's no great conspiracy to bind us. There's no reason to spend until 3 in the morning in our disenchanted era. The question to me is, why is it impossible, even with a phenomenal mind who I have deep respect for and who I enjoy speaking with, why neither of us have any pulse or impulse or inclination whatsoever to forming a movement? Unfathomable in that moment. Energetically unfathomable, existentially unfathomable, intellectually unfathomable. And I think part of the problem is writing. We both have things to write. And I think that's exactly an obstruction to these possibilities at some level. So great question. Sahej, nice to see you.
Hello, Jason. This is quite a game you've set for all of us. And it's always great to see you.
Same here.
Actually, I won't like you're holding your cards. I'm also going to not tell you what I would ask them, but when I would ask them. So what I found at least a little puzzling was, people kind of brought up the whole idea of asking them, was it worth it at the tail end of the game, and I feel what's more exciting is the other side of it, and the beginning. In fact, even the preface that Lecomte writes is, the great game is irredeemable. It's played only once. We wish to play it every moment of our lives. It is a case of loser wins. It's quite interesting because at this stage they actually know that the game is a lost cause, right? It is later when they are sort of caught in the sort of these other sort of games that Andre Breton and the larger kind of world outside is sort of playing with them, is when they kind of lose, I guess, track of that. And so I'd go to that point, and again, I won't tell you what I'll ask, but that's when I'll ask them.
This is no. Could you finish what you wanted to say, please?
No, that's all. Thanks.
No, it's again, you're pulling at my heartstrings, because one of the things is not the question, you just said it, essentially. I want to distill to the fact that one of my greatest points of agony in reading them is not that they didn't win the game. It's that they didn't lose it the right way. You know, that they did lose, but would that have been the definition of loss, the ideal or ultimate definition of loss, the way they wanted to lose the game? You know, Lecomte in the back of a bar in Paris with owned by an old lady who was letting him stay in the back room, jabbing a dirty morphine needle in his leg. I don't think that's what they meant by losing. You know, that's something that has some slight romantic exoticism to us in a kind of dark way, but it's just I've met people like that who just, it's a waste. It's an absolute waste. And so the question of why they weren't allowed to lose well, if all they wanted to do was lose on their own terms, but the world is so ruthless and brutal and obscene, or to use Beckett's word, appalling, that it wouldn't even allow them to go out on their own terms. You know, that's the futurists too. They said in 10 years, there'll be new people looking to destroy us and burn our works, but they don't need to. They can find us in the airplane hangars. We'll burn our own works to clear a path for them. And most of the futurists were shot by Mussolini. You know, so they didn't even get the opportunity to destroy their own works, you know, in that way. That's actually a great point of view. And the when, you know, or the how they would have lost. At that stage too, they'd become so estranged. You see, even Domal has given up on Lecomte, his brother, at that point. So whether or not they even could have gotten together one last time in order to lose the game, you know, the when is really crucial here, what you said this. That's a great point.
Sorry,
yeah.
I just wanted to add that, like I don't mean to kind of romanticize the kind of, you know, the fate that kind of came upon them. But what I mean is, at the outset, they sort of prepared themselves, or were poised to account for even this inevitable kind of outcome, like inevitable only
Yeah.
in, like, to us, I guess, but at that point they were sort of they were all right with it, you know.
Yeah, I
Maybe much
think you're
worse.
right. That's a good point. No, and I don't think you were. I tend to romanticize their downfall, and so that's why I always try to catch myself, because it's the same thing we can do with images of revolutionary death. You know, the idea of Che Guevara being killed by the CIA sounds super heroic, but he's an actual person who gets shot, you know, like a dog. There's nothing profound or beautiful about that, you know, at the same time that it is sacrificial and archetypal, and I can see those resonances. This is what Mahmoud Darwish, by the way, the Palestinian poet, always disliked about ceremonial funeral services for suicide bombers. It wasn't the moral question of whether they were there about their violence. It was that the overnight desire to turn them into martyrs, and to turn actual flesh and blood human beings who had just had their guts spilled out across the street into an icon, into an image. He found that obscene, you know? And so I have to always catch myself when I want to think, what a worthy death, or what a glorious, you know, it sounds that way, but again, it also precludes the question of, was there a better way to lose? That they could have devised if they had only had a chance, or could see through the mist of all the things that were transpiring around them. You know, they were really in a fog of militancy and conspiracies and circumstances and pressures and poverty and a million other things, you know. So it's a great, that's for us to ask, like, how would we have dreamed a more beautiful ending for them? If we do that gesture, then we do understand what it is to be a Palestinian poet, who actually have to write requiems for those who die in awful situations, in order to make the death appear at least slightly more enlivened or elegant than it often is. That's our one token that we can offer them. It's a great thing, Saj. It's so good to see you and have you here. Jonathan, go ahead.
Hey Jason, hey everyone.
Hi.
It's great to be here. This is already a great class. I'm
Round two.
excited.
What's wrong with you coming back?
I know. I love it. I love it. I'm addicted. I guess my question here is we're talking about this as a game. We talked about it like them as having this ghostly existence and their lives and stuff. But if it's a game, like, can you cheat? I would ask them that. Like, can you cheat? What are the cheats? What do you have to do? What can you avoid?
Excellent question. Nietzsche, in his tightrope metaphor, which is not a metaphor, in his image of the tightrope walk, says you cannot jump steps. You can't cheat that test. I think they would agree with Nietzsche that you cannot cheat having to go through all the steps. But are there cheat codes, almost like in video game culture, that give you powers, right? Or give you,
because their names are codes, they code themselves.
Yes, exactly. So I do think that's a form of cheating that definitely they build into the apparatus of their games. That allow them things like one of the first cheat codes I remember. I'm old enough that I remember the history of video games. I had an Atari when I was like 5, right? But it wasn't until I think Nintendo that you could have cheat codes that would allow you infinite lives or endless lives in the game. And so is that one of their cheat codes? Do they just, are they able to give themselves multiple possibilities to try again and all that? Yeah, I think that's a great one for sure. Let you be on the lookout for that too. So when they're playing, that's great. Who else? Andrew, do you see anyone?
Yes, we've got Akshat and James is gonna go and then Akshat.
Is the great game for everyone? And then what is the role of the elders in the great game?
Wow. Yeah, is the great game. They seem to suggest in one of their writings that we read from that it could liberate everyone. But the interesting word was could. And again, it's that Nietzschean, a book for all and none, which is, it's not a tyrannical or totalitarian exclusivity. It's just that the game is going to weed people out, and this is a mystical principle that you see in Akhtar's Conference of the Birds, for any of you who are familiar with that text, where thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of birds begin this journey to go meet the legendary phoenix creature. And by the time it's done, by the time they get through the 7 valleys, the valley of nothingness, the valley of rapture, the valley of a million different things, there's 30 left, because hundreds of thousands have died along the way, have fallen along the way. I think so it's a universal quest, but not everyone's going to make it. It's, again, we're not even sure they make it, and so in the fullest sense. So I would say that's a great question. Is it fair? And then the question of the elders, that's an intriguing one. They have phantom elders, like when they create some sympathetic magical object like a doll, that they construct, who's kind of an elder, and that's the power of the idol, like in ancient civilizations. And then there are these ghosts, and when Bataille writes his book on Nietzsche, and at the beginning he says this beautiful line, something like, I imagine Nietzsche walking by this lake and resting against that huge pyramid rock that he used to stand by. And I imagine Nietzsche laughing. And every time I imagine Nietzsche laughing, I start to cry. Well, Georges Bataille is a French guy who's never been there and never met Nietzsche. But the way he talks is as if they're blood brothers, right? There's such unparalleled intimacy and vulnerability in the way in which he exchanges with this figure, with this ghost, with this elder of the game, that only would be possible from never having met him. Does that make sense? So I think that's their interesting relationality to the elders of the game, is that they become almost blank slates on which you can project infinite proportions and shapes and masks. So we'll get into that. And when we notice they're on the rare occasions when they do reference, it's a great question. Akshat, go ahead, please then. Thank you.
So mine is a rather simple one. I would ask them whiskey or champagne, and then we would drink on a nice Paris evening. So
I like
nothing
that.
more than that, because that is the way you experience the transcendental.
Good. Remember, they might give you the third option and give you absinthe.
Okay.
Back in the time when absinthe actually existed in its form. If you ever find yourself in Prague in Czechoslovakia, don't believe the hype. They're not really selling absinthe. It's just everything is an absinthe bar with big green neon lights. But at any rate, no, that is a good question. I think they would enjoy that question for sure. And they'd be happy to indulge. All right, then, everyone. We are 5 minutes over our game for today. So for next week, I think it's on the syllabus, and Andrew will send a message to everyone clarifying with the first readings. I think it's pages 7 to 41, but we just read 7 to like 15. But it's okay, because every one of these pieces will take a while. We're going to start with the preface next week. Read it. It's only 2 pages, written by Gilbert Lecomte himself. We're going to read the preface, and then we're going to read whatever more we can get into from those pages. So come ready with notes, with quotes, with selections, with all kinds of articulations and observations. They can be half-finished ones. They can be jaggedly unformed. They can be whatever, and we'll brainstorm it together and try and make sense of things. All right. Great seeing everyone. It's going to be fun. Be well.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Guys.
Thanks.
Thank you.